industrial base is cybersecurity risks to our supply chains. Clearly, cybersecurity risks can disrupt supply chains, but Ms. Neuberger is leading the sort of focused response to the ransomware issue.
That'll be siloed, two different things. Are they working together?
I would not say it's siloed.
Yeah.
We work very closely. I think Peter and I being up here shows you how closely the National Economic Council and National Security Council work together on issues where it makes sense for us to come together. And so on cybersecurity, you've seen us behind the scenes working together to figure out how we can leverage our tools and our convening power to have a whole government response repeatedly.
Okay, last one right in the middle. Go ahead.
Will
Right, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Will the administration work on unbundling large contracts to ensure that Black-owned companies can compete for them?
No. So we are very focused on trying to make sure that our Build Back Better agenda, sorry, it's hard to say. Is it okay if I stand here?
Sure.
To be able to look? Yeah, I relate. I relate. No, we are really focused on making sure that as we talk about diversifying supplier bases here in these reports, that we are not just talking about small businesses, but we're talking about disadvantaged businesses as well, and minority-owned businesses. And so you've seen in our American Jobs Plan that we put proposals in there related to small business and strengthening small business, and we know that an important piece of that is leveraging federal procurement and the power of federal procurement to support those businesses. So.
Christian's been very eager in the back. Go ahead, Christian. Last actual one.
You talked about the Export-Import Bank and some of the financing that's going to be done to shore up industrial manufacturing here in the United States. Under the previous administration, though, China was one of the top destinations of U.S. export-import financing. An overwhelming majority of that money actually went to state-owned enterprises. Is the administration looking at anything in terms of financing that goes to some of these industries overseas? Shouldn't the priority be making certain that money stays here?
So that's actually exactly the proposal we're asking the Export-Import Bank's board to evaluate, is a new window that would foster direct Ex-Im Bank financing for the construction of manufacturing and infrastructure here in the United States. Obviously, they have a long-standing set of programs that finance the export of products made in the United States to foreign buyers. But actually, it's exactly what we're asking them to look at as ways to expand the financing for construction and investment here in the U.S.
Thank you both so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Always welcome.
Thank you.
We love to talk about supply chain here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just two more items for all of you at the top. Yesterday in Guatemala City, following a bilateral meeting with the Guatemalan president, the vice president announced a new effort to partner with Guatemala around security, economic development, and anti-corruption. Today in Mexico, the vice president will hold a bilateral meeting with President Obrador. They'll discuss our economic relationship, security cooperation, and stemming migration. The vice president and President Obrador will witness the signing of a memorandum of understanding between the United States and Mexico to establish a strategic partnership to cooperate on development programs in the region. And the vice president will also meet with labor leaders, women entrepreneurs, and U.S. Embassy staff before she returns to the United States. One last item for all of you. We have more good news on the global fight against COVID-19. Today, the MasterCard Foundation and MasterCard pledged to make a $1.3 billion contribution to help make critical progress in providing vaccines to people across Africa in partnership with the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This is a significant commitment to acquire COVID-19 vaccines for at least 50 million people and to build long-term manufacturing and equitable distribution capacity, which will further enable efforts to provide vaccines and strengthen the continent's ability to prepare for future pandemics. This is a welcome addition to our announcement last week that approximately 5 million of our first tranche of COVID-19 vaccines will be shared with African countries in coordination with the African Union. Which vaccines? They're providing funding, a contribution of funding to ensure that these vaccines are provided to Africa. I don't have the
whichever vaccines they take.
It's again funding to the Africa CDC version of the CDC, so it will be distributed through there. With that, Darlene, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you. Have the President and Senator Capito had their conversation yet, and what can you tell us about it if they have?
They have not had a conversation yet, but they will have a conversation this afternoon. And the president looks forward to continuing the discussion with the senator. He appreciates her good faith engagement over the last few weeks. I would reiterate, as was noted in the statement we put out last week, that while the president came down by quite a bit in his proposal, from his initial proposal on the American Jobs Plan, the latest offer that we had seen from Senator Capito's group did not meet the essential needs of our country to restore roads and bridges, prepare us for a clean energy future, and create jobs. So today they'll have a discussion about what more there is to discuss, I guess, and what the path looks like forward. I will also note that the president will also speak with other senators this afternoon, still finalizing who those will be, and we'll have readouts of that as well, who have been engaged in discussions about a bipartisan infrastructure proposal, engaged with each other, so he'll have those discussions as well. Expect we'll have a readout, as I noted. We're encouraged by these discussions and see them as an additional viable path forward. And he'll ask members of his jobs cabinet, or he's already asked them, I should say, to remain engaged in the days ahead, the period of time when he's on his foreign trip, although, of course, he'll remain engaged from there as well, with all members who are interested in working together on making a historic investment in infrastructure. And just third piece I would note, Darlene, as we're kind of since you asked about the president engagement, he's also going to stay closely engaged with Democratic leadership about the path forward, especially in light of the markup on the surface transportation bill happening tomorrow in the House and the interest by Speaker Pelosi, Leader Schumer, and other leaders in Congress on moving forward, and certainly an interest in doing that. Finally, last thing I would note is the expected passage later today of the U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness Act in the Senate this afternoon, which is a down payment on the president's proposed investment in R&D to make us more competitive, as well as the important work that Senator Wyden has undertaken on clean energy tax credits, a priority the president shares. So I would just note, as I've stated many times before in here, there are a number of paths for moving the president's bold ideas forward. We're moving on all of them full speed ahead.
One more question. Sure. Since the president is the head of the Democratic Party, would he support legislation that is now on the governor's desk in Nevada that would move Nevada to first place in the presidential primary process, up from third place?
I certainly understand the interest, but I'm not going to weigh in on the order of presidential primary contests from here. Go ahead, Mary.
On the infrastructure talk, Senator Capito has said she's not going to be coming to this conversation armed with a new offer. As you note, the president has rejected the Republicans' latest counteroffer. It doesn't seem that he's willing to come down any further. So are we at an impasse here?
We certainly don't see it that way. He's looking forward to discussing the path forward with Senator Capito. He sees her as an important and viable partner as we look to how we're going to get his bold ideas signed into law. And again, I'd note that there's also Democrats and Republicans, as you have seen and many of you have reported on, who are discussing how they can work together on what a path forward would look like, where there might be more investment in clean energy jobs and might be a higher number than what we've seen by the proposals to date. So again, there are a lot of paths forward, and he looks forward to discussing what they look like with Senator Capito and others this afternoon.
Is the president, though, willing to offer any other concessions in these negotiations, or is it safe to say that you view the ball as being in the Republicans' court here?
Look, I think this is, as any negotiation is, it's about both sides looking to see how much they can come to the other side and how much you have to give. The president has come down by about $1 trillion. That's quite a bit. Obviously, we'd like to see more, but there are a number of opportunities and paths to have these discussions moving forward.
I wonder just broadly, if you could explain a little bit more how the president has been preparing for this big trip tomorrow. How much time has he been spending in briefings? Just sort of how has he been getting ready for this upcoming?
Well, first I will say that he's been getting ready for 50 years. He has been on the world stage. He's known a number of these leaders for decades, including President Putin and including a number of the leaders he'll see at NATO and he'll see at the G7. Now, this is an important opportunity for him to see them in person, and there's nothing like face-to-face engagement in diplomacy. And for him, somebody who, as you've seen, the fact that he's welcomed in Democrats and Republicans to the Oval Office, that's just an indication of how much he feels that format is effective. So he's been engaging with his team, talking about what bilateral conversations he'll be having, where there are opportunities, where there are moments to voice the United States concern where necessary. But again, he's got quite a several decades of experience to build on here. So, he'll be relying on that during his trip. Go ahead, Phil.
Secretary Granholm on Sunday said that it was frustrating that a pathway for a bipartisan deal hadn't come to fruition yet. Does the president share that frustration at this point?
Well, I would say the president has a benefit of 36 years in the Senate, where he has seen that the sausage making is messy. It takes time. There are ups and downs in the roller coaster. We're right in the middle of the sausage making right now. And the president's view is that it's a good sign that there are several viable paths forward, that we are having good faith conversations, of course, with Democrats and our Democratic colleagues and partners, but also with a number of Republicans. That's a good sign. At the same time, the House is moving forward with marking up key components of the American Jobs Plan. So the fact is, this train is moving on several tracks. That's how we know these larger packages, larger proposals often move forward, and we're encouraged by the variety of options.
And along the lines of the sausage making, given the scale of the president's ambitions with the proposals he's put on the table, is the real reason that he's still in bipartisan negotiations right now because moderate Democrats are saying we need to stay in bipartisan negotiations right now, or does he think something can come?
The president wouldn't be spending his time engaging in hours of discussions with Republicans if he didn't think something could come from it. Now, we can't predict what the final outcome is, and we're keeping his only lines in the sand, as you know, Phil, are inaction and raising taxes on Americans making less than $400,000 a year. We know there are a lot of Democrats who are eager to move forward, as are we, but we think there are a lot of paths forward where it's worth continuing to pursue bipartisan discussion. Go ahead.
Thank you. About the vice president's trip, why is it then that when the vice president is asked if she has plans to visit the border, she says we've been to the border, even though she has not as vice president?
Well, as the vice president, she does speak for the actions of the people in the administration. She certainly helps oversee. I expect that sometimes she may go to the border, Peter, but as you know, what her focus has been, what the assignment is specifically, is to work with leaders in the Northern Triangle. She's on a trip doing exactly that, exactly what the president asked her to do.
And as we understand it, though, her main focus is to try to address the root causes of migration. Did somebody decide here that it would not be helpful for her to go to the border and talk to people who just migrated here?
Well, again, I think that at some point she may go to the border. We'll see. But she's in the Northern Triangle now to have discussions with leaders, with community leaders, with civil society leaders, with the embassy about how we can work together. And obviously she's made a couple of announcements already, probably more to come before she comes back to the United States.
And she described, though, you said she might go to the border. She described a trip to the border yesterday as a grand gesture. Why?
Look, Peter, again, I think her focus of this trip is on meeting with leaders, having a discussion about how to address corruption, how to address the root causes, how to work together to address humanitarian challenges in these countries. That's exactly what she's doing on the ground, and I'm sure she'll report back to the president when she returns. Go ahead.
I'm going to follow up with the border in a second, but let me ask you, if I can, on infrastructure. You laid out some of the conversations that the president is having, including sort of his message to some of the Democrats on Capitol Hill right now, to sort of get a little bit detail there. Would the president's support, does he want Democrats to more actively pursue the process of reconciliation as an option?
Well, Peter, I would say that the Democrats are already moving forward on marking up components of the bill. And Democratic leadership has been clear that they want to move forward on infrastructure and making a historic investment in infrastructure. There'll be a discussion about the mechanics of that, over the course of the coming days, and we'll have more to read out once those discussions have been had.
So we can't, in terms of like the time frame for those decisions to be made, obviously the message is Democrats is keep going and we might need you.
Well, look, I think to be clear, the president's always going to continue to pursue opportunity to work with Republicans, regardless of what mechanics are moving forward in the House. He's going to keep pursuing those opportunities, and we fully expect that there will be several pathways that are moving on different channels as we look to how we're going to get this American Jobs Plan passed.
As it
As it relates to the border right now, we heard from the Vice President yesterday where her message was very simple and blunt. She said to those migrants who would be considering coming, she said, do not come. Obviously, there's some progressive Democrats, among other critics, who have been frustrated by that. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, perhaps most prominently, saying it was disappointing to see. She said, among other things, that seeking asylum at any U.S. border is a 100% legal method of arrival. What does the White House say to those progressive Democrats, among others, who are frustrated by the message the White House is delivering?
Well, first, of course it is. And one of our focuses and the priorities of the President and the Vice President is to improve asylum processing at the border, to work with a range of Democrats and hopefully Republicans, because in history it's been a bipartisan effort to get immigration reform passed, to ensure there's a more viable pathway to citizenship and a better processing at the border. What the Vice President was simply conveying is that there's more work to be done, that we don't have these systems in place yet. It's still a dangerous journey, as we've said many times from here and from many forums before, and we need more time to get the work done to ensure that asylum processing is where it should be.
And last question about the Senate report, bipartisan Senate report, as it relates to what happened on January 6th. Obviously, it addressed the security planning, the response failures. We know that that's held up on Capitol Hill right now. Your reaction to that, and what, if anything, more the White House can do as it relates to those security failures in terms of planning and the like?
Well, first let me just reiterate that, of course, the events of January 6th were an assault on our democracy and the rule of law, and the President has been outspoken in calling for a full and independent investigation to what transpired. As it relates to the report, our team is currently reviewing the report and its findings to inform our ongoing efforts to ensure something like that could never happen again, and what role, of course, the federal government can play. There are many roles, as you know, that the report seems to surface on what officials on Capitol Hill could do, and we want to assess how we can be a good partner in this effort moving forward. I would also note that on his first full day in office, he asked his team to launch a review on how we can improve the federal government's response to the threat of domestic terrorism, something he also touched on when he was in Tulsa last week, and we'll be releasing that broader strategy soon as well. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. The FDA has still not cleared the 60 million AstraZeneca doses that are part of the President's commitment to share 80 million doses overseas by the end of June. Is there any concern that the administration will not get that approval from the FDA in time? And if that were the case, will the U.S. then make up for those 60 million doses with other available vaccines in order to meet the President's deadline of the end of June?
Right. Well, we, as you know, can't predict or expedite the timeline here. It's the FDA who will make that decision about when those doses will be approved, if and when they will be approved. We do remain committed to ensuring that we meet our commitment of 80 million doses, getting those out to the global community by the end of June, which is, again, 5 times more than any other country and 13% of our own supply. It's only June 8th, so we have quite a bit of time, but we remain committed to that. And obviously, if the FDA approves AstraZeneca doses, then that will be a component of that supply.
And just as a fuller question on behalf of our colleagues at the Canadian Press as well as Global News, on the timeline for reopening the U.S.-Canada border, Canada has said it will look to take a phased approach. Does the White House see an announcement happening in concert, or is the U.S. prepared to ease those restrictions on its own?
Well, again, we would make a decision about the Canada border based on the guidance of our health and medical experts. And I'm sure that when that decision is made, we would communicate through diplomatic channels, but I don't have anything to predict about the timeline. Go ahead, Maura.
Thank you. You've mentioned how long the president has spent in the Senate. He's talked himself about how timing and sequencing things are really key to presidential leadership. Does he have an objection to starting with H.R. 4 instead of H.R. 1? In other words, why not do the John Lewis Act first?
I think he is quite open to what Democratic leadership feels is the viable path forward, and will work closely with them in coordination.
There's a difference of opinion on that, on what would be the best one to go for.
We're not going to be the arbiters of that, but we will discuss with them. We will discuss with them as we look ahead what the right path forward is.
Okay, and my second question, just on infrastructure, in terms of the people he's speaking to this afternoon, will one of them be Mitt Romney?
We will give readouts of who he's spoken with once we've completed those calls, but I don't have anything to preview for you at this moment.
Mitt Romney.
Has he ever spoken to him in his life? It's a good question. He's spoken with a number of Republicans. As you know, we don't read them all out. I don't have anything to read out for you, but he has, obviously, in a different circumstances, had conversations.
In terms of these different paths and different groups, this group that he's going to talk to
Yeah.
this afternoon, is this the first time that he's starting to kind of reach out to them? He's been really focusing on Capito up until now.
That's right. We've been engaged with a range of Democrats and Republicans, including members who have been in conversation through this group at a staff level. He's obviously had discussions with a number of them about how he moves his ideas forward. So I wouldn't make it as firm as a first time, but certainly discussing this as a viable path forward at his level at this point in the process, would be an indication of how we see this as a viable path. Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, just to follow up on the question on voting rights, you said yesterday that we will stay lockstep with the Democratic leadership on that path forward. And what Pelosi said in her letter today is that the HR 4 is not going to be ready until the fall. So are you, and to focus effort on the Senate passing HR 1. So are you okay with that kind of time frame, even if that means that basically this issue languishes until the fall?
Well, first, we don't see it as languishing. Obviously, the president has asked the vice president to lead this effort, and I'll give you a bit of an update that in addition to, of course, engaging with federal efforts on the federal level to move legislation forward, she's also going to use the power of the White House to convene key stakeholders, and she'll be hosting several events next week when she returns from her trips, just to give you an indication of how quickly and how focused we will be on these efforts. And she'll fight for our key bills and also to register voters under the president's historic executive order, as well as advocate for democratic principles. So I will say we're going to work, of course, with Democratic leadership on both, even with their disagreements about what the order of events should be here. But we're not going to wait for that. We're going to use the White House as a convener. We're going to use the bully pulpit. Obviously, when the president was in Tulsa just last week, he talked about voting rights very passionately and forcefully. I'll also note that we're also continuing to work to implement the executive order that the president signed into law early on in his administration. And that executive order uses every authority available to make voting easier, more accessible, and more fair. It directs agencies to expand access to voter registration and election information, assists states under the National Voter Registration Act, improves and modernizes vote.gov, increases federal employees' access to voting, analyzes barriers to voting for people with disabilities, increases voting access for active duty military and other voters overseas. So I would just note that we are not relying on just one option here. Of course, federal legislation is something he will continue to press for, but we'll use the bully pulpit, we'll use our convening power, we'll continue to press through on implementing this executive action as well.
Separate issue, there was a report this morning about basically